History as it happens, October 21st, 2021. Remembering Colin Powell.
Our strategy to go after this army is very, very simple. First, we're going to cut it off, and then we're going to kill it.
Principally military targets, command and control installations.
My decision to reappoint General Colin Powell as chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
The question I faced was, should I enter politics and seek the presidency of the United States? Many of you have encouraged me to do so.
He is a transformational figure. He is a new generation coming into the world, onto the world stage, onto the American stage. And for that reason, I'll be voting for Senator Barack Obama.
Colin Powell lived a remarkable life. In a public career spanning 4 decades, he fought wars, counseled presidents, and became a role model. And by the mid-1990s, he was arguably the most respected and admired political or military figure in the country. He was a moderate Republican, now an extinct species. And he'll also be remembered for a speech he lived to regret before the UN in 2003. So let's begin to assess his legacy. Next, as we report History as it Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
For Saddam Hussein, possession of the world's most deadly weapons is the ultimate trump card, the one he must hold to fulfill his ambition.
When someone like Colin Powell dies, doesn't it feel like a chapter is closing? I mean, I was shocked when I saw the news. I didn't know he was sick and didn't realize he was 84 years old. But then when you start to reflect on his life and his times, you realize that he entered our lives for the first time in a major way a long time ago. It was 1991.
As the Secretary pointed out, this is a large combined arms army. It has tanks, it has personnel carriers, it has air defense guns. It has very redundant, resilient...
And that was General Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, briefing reporters on live TV as the U.S.-led coalition began annihilating Saddam Hussein's military in the first Gulf War. I was not quite 16 years old, but 6 years later, in 1997, I met Colin Powell, then a retired general who had decided not to run for president the year before. It was my very first job, a reporter for a tiny radio station in Pompton Lakes, New Jersey. Powell was giving some remarks at a local college, and after his speech, I sat right next to him at a small table. He turned to me so I could ask my question, and I don't remember what I said or what my assignment even was, but I do remember feeling that I was in the presence of a special person. At that time, Powell's reputation was impeccable. 6 years later came the moment he would regret.
We know that Saddam Hussein is determined to keep his weapons of mass destruction. He's determined to make more.
And that was his presentation at the United Nations just weeks before the U.S. would invade Iraq. A presentation that was based on a fantasy, not reality.
What do we choose to remember first about people? And what do we choose to have be their defining characteristic?
And that's historian Jeffrey Engel. He'll be here in a moment to begin assessing the import of Powell's life and times. As I said before, 30 years is a long time in this rapidly changing world. And as I've thought about Powell the past few days, it occurred to me that his world, the world of the Cold War, followed by the U.S. victory over Saddam in 1991, that world is long gone, and U.S. leaders have long since abandoned the Powell Doctrine. And for all the odes describing Powell as a warrior statesman, we have to remember he was a reluctant warrior. For instance, he opposed sending U.S. forces into the Balkans in the early 1990s. I suppose that makes his 2003 speech to the UN about WMD all the more perplexing, because it helped lead to an invasion and occupation a younger Powell would have opposed. Jeffrey Engel is founding director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, and he is the author of When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War, and he is the editor of Into the Desert, Reflections on the Gulf War. Jeffrey Engel, welcome back.
Always good to talk to you.
Whenever a major figure dies, we always have a lot to think about, not only his life or her life, but the times in which they lived, how they influenced those events, how events influenced them. Powell's career spanned 4 decades. He was a soldier, a statesman. There's a lot to process here. What's on your mind?
You know, I'm completely with you that Colin Powell is, in many ways, the embodiment of the American dream. He is the American post-World War II story for good and for ill. the triumphs of post-World War II America, in particular, the fact that we've become a more egalitarian society, is clearly evident in Powell's life. I'm sure we'll go into it, but obviously the first African-American to do many things in our nation's history in the Army and the State Department. And yet Powell is also involved in many of the tragedies of the post-war period, intimately involved in Vietnam, intimately involved in military planning for the 1980s and the 1990s, and then finally, ultimately, involved perhaps not enough in the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003. So you can really map American history onto his life and vice versa.
The first thing that came to my mind when I saw the news was his 2003 speech to the UN. He had been a skeptic. He had been at odds with Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld in the Bush administration about invading Iraq. And then he appears before the UN in February of 2003, so just a month, weeks before the invasion, and he gives the speech that he later said he regretted. Whether they knew it was BS at the time or they only realized it later on that no, WMD existed, and that could be a separate debate, right? Whether they lied or not. But that certainly has stained his legacy. And I think the reason I thought of that first is because of our current moment, right? I mean, you might call that presentism. We're staring down 2 decades of failure in the global war on terrorism, and that moment, one of many that epitomizes that failure.
What I found really interesting about the moment that the nation heard about Powell's passing is it was not necessarily a knee-jerk reaction to think about the 2003 Iraq speech at the United Nations, mostly because he did so many other things. But it really forces us as historians and as citizens to ask an epistemological question, I guess, which is, what do we choose to remember first about people? And what do we choose to have be their defining characteristics? So Colin Powell's speech at the United Nations in 2003, actually, I think is one of the defining moments of his life for sure, but actually reveals a lot about his life too, his political life. Because as you mentioned, it's a speech that he regretted. Powell is sent to the United Nations to make the appeal, and Powell is sent to the United Nations by the administration to make the appeal because he is, frankly, the most credible person within the upper levels of the administration. He has the best reputation overall with the globe and with the American people because of his long years of service, and also because, frankly, no one would ever consider him a hawk on war and on military affairs. The idea being, therefore, well, if Powell's in favor of it, well, then we should all be in favor of it.
Given Saddam Hussein's history of aggression, given what we know of his grandiose plans, given what we know of his terrorist associations, and given his determination to exact revenge on those who oppose him, should we take the risk that he will not someday use these weapons?
Obviously, he regrets that he was duped in some ways. He was given false information. He was used by others in the administration and was furious with others in the administration. And when we look back at 2003, we don't think of Powell as a hawk pushing for war, but we do think of him as perhaps the person who was best positioned to stop the war. Now, that's perhaps an impossible burden to say that one man is required to stand up and stop an administration in a White House that's hell-bent on war, which I think the Bush administration was in 2003. But Powell being so prominent with such a great reputation and also being Secretary of State, if you had to pick one guy who could have stood up and stopped it, he would be the guy.
As you and others have pointed out, the Bush administration was targeting Iraq right after 9/11. So I think hell-bent is the right way to put it, and whether Powell could have stopped that himself, hard to say. At least publicly, he didn't try very hard, and the 2003 speech before the UN clinched that he wouldn't.
Yeah, I think publicly is really, we should put a lot of emphasis on that sense, because Powell was a Washington insider and a politician, even during his military days. So he was extraordinarily well-versed in how to leak information to news sources. So in essence, the policy interested public, people who were debating Iraq in 2003, were almost all in unison in believing that Powell did not approve or did not endorse.
That's right.
Or was not enthusiastic.
Yeah, we knew that he and Cheney and Rumsfeld were not on the same page.
Yeah, and it raised a really, really interesting question of what a person could do if they oppose the president and oppose the administration, especially someone who had been brought up in the military where the answer from your commander in chief is yes, sir. Powell said subsequently, well, I guess I could have resigned and that would have been a nice headline for one day, but then they just would have found someone else to go along with it.
So let's get into the context of Powell's tenure as Secretary of State, a historical development I'd like to get your take on. This may not have started with Powell, but over the past 2, 3, 4 presidential administrations, what we have seen is the eclipsing of the Secretary of State, the office, in importance and in clout and in influence by the Secretary of Defense. Donald Rumsfeld was arguably the most influential and powerful Secretary of Defense in recent American history.
All you have to do is follow the dollars on that one. The Pentagon has a budget that dwarfs most countries, not only most countries' military budgets, but most countries' GDP. And consequently, the person who is in charge of that is extraordinarily powerful at the same time that the State Department budget, dollar for dollar, has consistently been cut and eroded by successive administrations, Democrat and Republican. And I think this, honestly, this could tell us a lot about America after Vietnam, when Americans were, on the one hand, obviously upset about their strategic loss in Vietnam, but also subsequently upset about how they perceived that they had treated the troops. So you develop by the 1990s in particular, a real ethos in Washington that the troops must be supported, that the troops are the best among us. And also, and I think this is really to the detriment of the military, that the troops in some ways can do no wrong because they don't fail. Give them a mission and they will accomplish it. Well, what that means over time is if you tell someone that you have a tool in your toolbox that never fails and that can do impossible things, you wind up giving them impossible tasks, which I think is one way to understand the failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, that we have trained an entire generation of officers and politicians to think that the military is Superman, are Supermen or Superwomen, whereas there is a consistent theme in American politics going well back into the 20th century, if not before, of distrust of diplomacy, of distrust of interaction with foreign affairs. And if you want to put this in a nutshell, why the Defense Department has become more powerful than the State Department, aside from the money, there's also the idea that why bother talking if we can kill?
If we've mastered war, if we've deluded ourselves into believing, as we might have done after the first Gulf War, that we have mastered war, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome, then military force becomes the primary instrument of foreign policy and diplomacy takes a back seat. And Powell, as Secretary of State, was a reluctant warrior as a career military man. I think he was in the Army for 35 years.
That's one of the reasons I think that Powell was brought in as Secretary of State, was because recall George W. Bush was quite young by presidential standards when he was elected, and of course in a controversial election. And
not informed about the world either.
Exactly. So especially in foreign affairs, let's bring in old Washington hands who really know what they're doing, people who are on first name basis with many global leaders like Dick Cheney, like Donald Rumsfeld, and like Colin Powell, who of course had been chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for critical years during the 1990s and was not only, as I mentioned before, well respected across the political spectrum, but well known for his judgment and his prudent nature throughout that period and well known throughout the world. So in essence, Powell was one of the people brought in to make the world and the United States feel more comfortable with an inexperienced president.
So I want to talk about Powell's earlier career, the less known aspects of it. We started off by talking about 2003 in the UN speech. But before we go to Vietnam and the foundation of his career, as a historian, Jeffrey Engel, you weigh everything in somebody's legacy. And of course, over time, more information will become available to you as a scholar. And events in our own time will influence how we reflect upon the past. It's a challenge, isn't it, weighing the good and the bad and the in-between when assessing someone's legacy?
I think one way to approach this difficult question of how to sum up a life as much as anything else in historical terms is what's the word that we use to define someone? So, for George H.W. Bush, we might say prudence. For Dwight Eisenhower, we might say organization. And for Powell, I would think prudence actually is a pretty good word as well, to be honest. But I would, if I was writing the history of, not Powell, but the history of American foreign relations at critical moments, I could easily write a history of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and frankly, a history of post 9/11 American engagement with the war on terror without mentioning Powell's name. He was not one of the architects of that war. He was the man who, followed behind the Pentagon and the CIA with a dust broom, sweeping up the messes diplomatically. He was in the White House as Secretary of State, but you don't need him to tell that story of why the United States went to war. Yeah. Whereas you can't tell the story of the first Gulf War without him. You can't tell the story, frankly, of American post-Vietnam military strategy without him. Powell, during his time in the early 1980s as an assistant to Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of Defense, really helped articulate what frankly should have been called the Weinberger Doctrine, but gets known as the Powell Doctrine. The idea that as a remedy to the problems of Vietnam, the United States should only go into conflicts where we have a sense of what we want to accomplish, have a clear outcome and political end. We should only go into conflicts with overwhelming military force. And that was the blueprint for the Gulf War, but it also was a blueprint for American strategy following the Gulf War. I mean, one way to understand why the United States was reluctant to intervene in the 1990s in places like Yugoslavia was because there was no solution to fit the Powell Doctrine. There was no way that the United States could send in 500,000 troops as they had done during the Gulf War. There was no clear sense of how to get out once you got in. Really, Powell was at the heart of designing the overall strategy for the American military and for American foreign policy in turn after the 1980s and after Vietnam.
Regarding the Powell Doctrine, he had an exchange on TV with Madeleine Albright. He cringed when Albright said, well, what's the point of having this great army if we're not going to use it? They were discussing Bosnia and the Balkans, and Powell saw no American interest or no easy exit from intervening in that situation. I think those values that he personified are largely absent from politics today, but the height of his prestige and influence really was the mid-1990s, when he decided he would not run for president.
Yeah, in fact, his relationship to running with the presidency actually is very illuminating as well. Powell, by the end of the Gulf War, when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and by the way, the Gulf War is the first televised war. It's the first CNN war, and Powell is really, really, really good in front of the camera. So, he grows in popularity as American success appears apparent in the war. And there is quiet discussion within the Bush administration that reached all the way to the president of perhaps we should replace Dan Quayle, the vice president, who frankly was not all that popular throughout the country, with Colin Powell, this man who seemed to check off so many boxes. He's an experienced guy, he's a military guy, he's a prudent guy. Frankly, it would be nice to have a little bit more diversity.
Yeah, great American success story.
Yeah, exactly. Truly rags to riches, or at least rags to prominence, and then subsequently riches. But, he decided again in 1996, there was talk of him running for president. And again, frankly, in 2000, there was talk of him running for president. And much like Dwight Eisenhower, it was not clear when he first broached the question or considered the question of running for president, which party he would run for. Ultimately, it became clear that he was himself a Republican, though we should talk about what kind of Republican.
That's right. The Republican Party of Colin Powell's time no longer really exists.
No, it does not. It does not. Absolutely not. And, he was, if you will, the small c conservative. So consequently, here's a man who is at the very, very, very least going to be the front runner in any presidential campaign that he enters, decides against it.
I've spent long hours talking with my wife and children, the most important people in my life, about the impact an entry into political life would have on us. It would require sacrifices and changes in our lives that would be difficult for us to make at this time.
The most popular rationale for why he chose not to run is because it would not be good for his family. And his wife in particular did not want him to run. And she was worried about his safety, frankly, as the first major African-American candidate running for president. Well, I guess actually Jesse Jackson was the first major African-American presidential candidate, but the first perhaps nominee of a party. I also think running for president would violate the Powell Doctrine. If the Powell Doctrine says you only get into wars and conflict if you are assured of success, well, Powell could not be assured of success, of victory, if he ran for president. So if you only enter games that you're going to win, that's not a game you can predict.
I know we're going to talk about Vietnam and his time in the 1980s in the Reagan administration, but one more point about this. I was chatting with a coworker yesterday about Powell in the mid-1990s. At that time, he was arguably the most well-respected and admired person in public life across the political spectrum. Democrats, Republicans had a favorable view of him, and of course our society was less tribal then than it is now. Of course, it's always been partisan, but not quite as poisonous as it is today with social media. And I asked my coworker, can you think of any figure in American life today, politics, whatever, who has that kind of standing? And we couldn't.
You know, the first name that comes to mind is Beyonce.
Is she running for president?
But she'd win if she did. I agree with you 100%. There is no one who is as respected. And I think we should not overlook the fact that Powell was so respected in the 1990s in many ways because he was not a politician,
Yes.
which meant he had no record to defend. He had been in the Army his entire career, and he had never taken critical votes that people were unhappy with. If there's one institution that Americans respect more than any other, by the 1990s at least, it's the United States military. Faith in the presidency has never recovered from Watergate. Faith in Congress, frankly, has never been good, but it hasn't recovered from the 70s. Faith in the Supreme Court is diminished in the last decade in particular, but Americans' faith in the institution of the military is the steadiest of our faiths. So a man who shows up in uniform with no record, except for having just been a triumphant general, that's pretty darn appealing.
Restraint, moderation. He seemed to have a lot of common sense. He spoke bluntly but politely. And in the mid-1990s, because the first Gulf War had seemed to go so well, at least from our perspective, minimal casualties on the American side, and mission accomplished because Saddam was expelled from Iraq, he enjoyed great standing in American society. So, to his earlier career, as promised. I guess I don't know a lot about his early life in the military. 2 tours of duty in Vietnam, and I'm assuming that those years really shaped his worldview.
I think his thinking about the world was clearly shaped both by his experience in Vietnam and then thinking about Vietnam afterwards. During his time in Vietnam, and actually, let's take a step back, just to remind everyone that he's truly an American success story. He's the child of immigrants, grows up in the Bronx, not in any way, shape, or form close to power or influence or money, joins the military and steadily rises through the ranks, largely because of his competence and intelligence. And so he has combat tours in Vietnam. But frankly, his combat tours in Vietnam, especially his first, he spent a lot of time quite literally out in the jungle, helping to train counterinsurgency forces and anti-communist militias, if you will, and was wounded. And therefore, in a sense, had a small perspective on Vietnam when he was first there, but ultimately came back to the United States and furthered his education and furthered his time in Washington and thought a lot and thought hard about why Vietnam had not worked. I mean, he had done his best. Why had this not been successful? And ultimately, he concluded it's because the American people weren't behind it and there was no clear goal. Stability is amorphous at best. And it's not as easy as saying, let's take Berlin or let's kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. So when he returns from Vietnam, it really colors the way that he approaches every subsequent event of his life, because there is an ingrained reluctance to deploy force. And he had been the tip of the spear to send men like himself into combat without knowing what they're ultimately there for and how you're ultimately going to get them out. So Vietnam is not just searing for the time he spent in Southeast Asia, but it's searing for the political aftermath as well, not least of which was that in the 1970s, there was a great concern by the late 1970s that Vietnam in some ways had broken the army, had broken the spirit of the army. There were all kinds of problems with race relations in the army during this period, drug abuse during this period. And there was a real sense for Powell and officers of his generation that we can restitch this together, but you only get one chance a generation at doing that. And another failure of the scale of Vietnam would break the institution that they had grown to love.
I was only 16 years old in 1991, but I do clearly remember vocal concerns being raised about getting bogged down in another Vietnam. Some of those concerns were based on the false premise that Iraq had a serious army. Iraq was exhausted by the Iran-Iraq War, and Saddam Hussein was a tin-pot dictator. It was really no threat to the United States militarily. How did Powell become Ronald Reagan's national security advisor?
He became national security advisor largely in the late 1980s, while still in the Army, of course, largely because he was considered all the things that we've already said. He was competent. He was middle of the road. He was reliable. He was loyal. He was, in many ways, an experienced Washington policymaker and bureaucrat. And the first years of the 1980s and Ronald Reagan's administration were marked by political confusion over foreign policy. Reagan went through a number of national security advisors.
It's interesting. I did not know that.
What must be remembered about the number of national security advisors that Reagan went through, there are really two principal reasons for that number. The first was intense White House infighting, a real factionalized White House and dog-eat-dog White House. And secondly, was the Iran-Contra affair. So if you put those two things together and you have a critical office within the White House that has become politicized and that was at the heart of a cover-up conspiracy that frankly should have led to impeachment, well, who do we know that can be both apolitical, a guy with a uniform, and who do we know is not going to get us involved in crazy schemes that are bordering on, if not completely illegal? Again, a guy with a lot of experience and trustworthiness. Now, that's not to say just wearing the uniform could have prevented anyone from getting into trouble. Remember, the central figure of Iran-Contra in many ways was Colonel Oliver North from the Marines, but Powell had a different reputation.
Iran-Contra, understudied, underappreciated, somewhat forgotten. I need to do an episode about that. Episode, but not to digress on Iran-Contra. Late 1980s, early 1990s, U.S.-Soviet negotiations. Was Powell a player in the talks with the Soviets at the end of the Cold War?
Again, this actually is a good example of the historical litmus test that I mentioned earlier, in that I could write a history of the end of the Cold War. I have written a history of the end of the Cold War, and not
very good one too.
Yeah, and not mention Powell vis-a-vis the Soviets. Powell is integral to the story of the end of the Cold War because simultaneously the Gulf War occurs, and you can't write the story of the Gulf War without him. But in terms of the reconciliation of East and West, that was the end of the Cold War. More critically, in terms of the reform and collapse of the Soviet Union, Powell, frankly, is not someone I would need to write into that story.
So to return to the Powell Doctrine in the first Gulf War, that world is gone. I mean, it's hard to imagine any conflict today where the Powell Doctrine might apply because, maybe I'm wrong about this, that era of conventional warfare, large armies on the battlefield between states, instead of, say, non-state actors, appears to be gone. History may prove me wrong. The future may prove me wrong. What do you think of that?
Oh, that's a tough one because I so desperately want you to be right.
Well, let me put it this way. The Powell Doctrine certainly doesn't apply to fighting terrorism, fighting terrorists, finding terrorists in countries where they're hiding.
I think that's right. I think one of the problems with the war on terror, as we've discussed before, is that there's no obvious victory moment. There's no obvious end game. Even the death of Osama bin Laden clearly did not end that conflict. And in fact, I think if we really dive in, if you don't mind, into the weeds for a moment of the short war that was the Gulf War,
go ahead.
Really illuminating for understanding Powell, because first of all, Powell was not in favor of using military force. I have multiple documents and multiple recordings of Powell saying privately, why are we fighting over Kuwait? Kuwait doesn't really matter. He was ultimately convinced that we did need to fight for two reasons. First, because his commander-in-chief said so. And second, because he understood, like others, that the end of the Cold War was going on simultaneously, and how the United States responded to a blatant aggression at the end of the Cold War was going to set a template for what the post-Cold War world was going to look like. But even still, even after saluting and saying, yes, sir, to President Bush about going to war, using military force, Powell is a very, very savvy bureaucrat. He does not want to actually see fighting break out because he's concerned about another Vietnam as much as anyone else. And so he actually at first constructs a war plan that is given to the Bush White House that was ludicrous, designed in many ways to produce the most casualties by the United States possible. One policymaker referred to it as, hey, diddle diddle right up the middle, which is to say, let's just send our tanks directly at them. that would have produced a lot of bloodshed. And the reason he was doing that was to inform the president yet again, though I think the president already understood, inform the president yet again that if you're going to do this, we're going to do this with such overwhelming force and frankly rely upon things like air power and rely upon our speed and mobility to reduce casualties. So in essence, he was saying to Bush, I don't want to do this war. And if you want me to do this war with 100,000 troops, it's going to be ugly. So you better give me everything I want. Bush did. Fast forward to the end of the war, the famous land war only lasted 100 hours, frankly, because of much of the devastation that had occurred the previous month from American air power, American and its allies, air power.
And Iraq was a hollowed out force too, as I mentioned before, the Iran-Iraq war.
Yeah, and if you had to design in a lab the perfect place for the American military to fight successfully, you couldn't pick a better place than the deserts of Iraq. This is a military that was designed to use technology and precision to take out Soviet tanks en masse. So doing so with basically no terrain to worry about was actually quite a nice place for the Americans to fight.
And probably Soviet tanks were being used by the Iraqi army too, so old ones.
They were, but this is one of the problems with military aid to allies. The Iraqis used Soviet-made tanks, but they couldn't update them. And frankly, they didn't keep them in good maintenance. So it's good technology, but like my car, if I forget to put the oil in for 5 years, something bad's going to happen eventually. But going back, if I did to the end of the war, Powell was instrumental in ending the war quickly. Why? Well, for two reasons. First, because the United States had achieved what he perceived to be its strategic goals. It had liberated Kuwait. And whereas other people in Washington were musing, not so much within the White House, frankly, but other people in Washington were musing about going on to Baghdad and eliminating Saddam Hussein as a long-term threat, Powell said that's not what we signed up for. And this is critical, this is a televised war. And Powell felt that we had reached at the end of the 100 hours such a level of military mastery that anything further was not going to be in some ways civilized. It was going to be just slaughter. We had already slaughtered, to his mind, tens of thousands of Iraqis in places like the Road of Death, for example, the road from Kuwait back to Iraq that basically became an open shooting pit for American air power. And Powell knew that television cameras were going to get there soon. And therefore, if we continue this violent slaughter, that too would set a precedent for the post-Cold War period that was uncomfortable. And he didn't want any part of that either.
One of the more fascinating insights in your book, When the World Seemed New, something I've mentioned on multiple podcasts with you and others, is when Saddam invaded Kuwait in 1990, the first reaction among several members of the George H.W. Bush administration, not just Powell, but Cheney and others, was, why do we care if a barrel of oil has an Iraqi or a Kuwaiti flag on it? But New World Order won out in the end. And when I say that, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist. It sounds very science fiction-y, New World Order. What I think it meant was if Saddam Hussein is allowed to make his own rules, then other dictators, other nations might believe they can make their own rules. So therefore, this was an opportunity to impose or reimpose or reinforce American hegemony over that part of the world.
And elsewhere, because one benefit of the Powell Doctrine, as it played out in Iraq, this was the idea anyway, was not just that the United States would maintain a new world order, emphasis on the word order, against aggressions anywhere in the world, not just in the Middle East, but that you had no chance in a hell of standing up to our military power, because we're not going to do this willy-nilly. We'll destroy you in a way that you cannot fathom and quicker than you can imagine. So if you are genuinely peerless as a military, you can go a long way to deterring other potential adversaries simply because they know that the military response will not end well for them.
What you're discussing here makes his 2003 speech before the UN sound even worse, because he knew it was a mistake. Do we know if he knew? Well, you said before that he had been duped possibly into thinking this intelligence was legit. I guess we don't know all the answers yet about that.
I think there are others who know the answers to that better than I do, to be honest. The story is confusing. The story is a reluctant former general, former soldier, put in a position to put his reputation on the line and basically given evidence that was both wrong and manipulated to make the case. So Powell would have said that he believed what he was saying at the time was true.
Even, looking at that speech, it's on YouTube. It's easy to find it online. He was showing these slides and these photos of huts and small buildings. And with the benefit of hindsight, looking back at it now, we're like, so what? Okay, they've got these buildings here, but we were in such a state of fear that anything, right? A nuclear bomb, a dirty bomb, anthrax, what have you.
Well, and I think both a sense of fear, Dick Cheney, vice president, frequently argued at this time, what might be best understood as a 1% doctrine, which is to say, if you graph out something bad, you have to graph out the consequence of that and then put that next to the likelihood of it. And because Cheney believed the consequence of a future terrorist attack might well be, as he put it, a smoking mushroom cloud over an American city, that consequence being infinite, if you will, on the graph, meant that you just had to have the tiniest fear or concern or evidence of the likelihood in order to act. I'm frankly of the opinion that Dick Cheney consciously manipulated the evidence to go to war, whereas Powell may have been duped. Dick Cheney was the duper. If you believe you can't lose, because see aforementioned discussion about the invincibility of the American military, if you can't lose, then the consequences of going to war are actually remarkably small.
And then from there, well, if we find WMD or find remnants of what may have been a WMD program, the whole thing is going to go so well that people will forgive us and democracy will sprout up from the ground with flowers, an American flag in every window and a chicken in every pot.
I mean, look at the way that the military was given its orders at this time. Remove Saddam Hussein and find weapons of mass destruction. Once the first was accomplished, ultimately the second was not accomplished, or at least it was accomplished in the sense that it was determined that there were no weapons of mass destruction. They looked to the political leadership, to the White House, to say, Mr. Commander-in-Chief, what are your orders? And the orders subsequently were build democracy, which frankly should not be a military option.
So let's close on a more political note. We mentioned it before, the Republican Party of Colin Powell's time, or that wing of the Republican Party, no longer exists. The moderate to liberal Republicans of the Northeast, I grew up with Christine Todd Whitman, for instance. Donald Trump released a statement after Colin Powell's death insulting him. I think that's
did he really? I didn't even see that. That's so.
Called him a rhino and made some mention about how the fake news media is adoring Colin Powell, who I guess made a bunch of mistakes in Trump's view. I guess that's where we're at. A once respected, moderate, centrist Republican military and political figure would have no home in this tribal, nasty, coarse moment in political life.
I'd hardly be the first one to say it. I'm just going to agree with you here. But President Trump and those who have adopted his tactics are jerks. And this is a family podcast, so I will use jerk as my hardest language. And I think the Powell example you just gave is really insightful. Powell represented many of the things that Donald Trump did not like. Donald Trump did not like moderate Republicans, does not like moderation. He did not like America's ever-present wars. So there's all kinds of reasons that Donald Trump would not like Powell's policies. But nothing requires you to kick dirt on someone's grave before it's even been filled in. Have some human decency, my God.
Well, he didn't make a principled argument about anything, not that we would expect some type of foreign policy analysis in a statement about somebody's death. He called him a rhino, Republican in name only. It was a short and sophomorically phrased statement. But I suppose the point is the Colin Powell wing of the Republican Party is gone, and that point was punctuated by Donald Trump's statement. And of course, Powell did not hide the fact that he did not like Trump, especially after the January 6th riot, a sitting president egging on a mob to attack another branch of government.
Yes. Sometimes we say these sentences out loud and we can't believe that they're actually true, that a president of the United States did not respect the electoral process, so the president of the United States would not, frankly, be mature enough to be present for the transfer of power. Powell was a man who grew up among institutions, in which one person was never as important as the institution, the U.S. military, the State Department, the U.S. government writ large, the American people writ large. He was a person who believed in service and sacrifice he was a good politician. Don't get me wrong. I mean, this guy was savvy and Machiavellian and knew how to leak information to the press. But the goal of that all was to save the republic and help the republic, not to undermine it.
Trump pulled a John Adams without the riot.
That makes John Adams. I know that's the historical case, but that makes John Adams look bad. Without the riot. Let's emphasize that part.
Well, my apologies to the Adams family, and my thanks to Jeffrey Engel for joining us again here. And I should tell you that he hosts a podcast of his own. It is called The Past, the Promise, the Presidency. And right now they're doing a series on presidential crises. On the next episode of History as It Happens, the sorrow of Haiti. Why can't America's neighbor, the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere, escape the cycle of crisis and mass emigration? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.